First story. So, this happened about 2 years ago, and I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out running at night. I've always been one of those people who enjoys jogging in the evening after a long day at work. The world just seems quieter, the air cooler, and it's a great way to unwind. I usually stick to the same route in my neighborhood, which takes me through a mix of residential streets and a small wooded park. That evening, I remember feeling extra restless, like I needed to clear my head. I had a big project at work that wasn't going well, and I was a little on edge. I figured a longer than usual run would help, so I changed things up and took a different path. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I had my phone, so I figured I wouldn't get lost. Spoiler alert, I didn't get lost, but I wish I had. The new route took me down a street I'd never really paid attention to before. It was one of those quiet, dimly lit roads that feels like it should be more populated, but for some reason, it isn't. The houses were older, most of them with chip paint or overgrown lawns, giving the whole place an abandoned vibe. As I jogged down the street, I noticed there wasn't a single car parked outside any of the houses. That should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. About halfway down the street, I heard what sounded like a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. I stopped in my tracks, pulled out my earbuds, and looked around. For a moment, everything was silent, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, this time followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it wasn't normal conversation. It sounded tense. I looked around, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the street was an old, 2-story house with no lights on. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The yard was a mess, with tall weeds and garbage strewn about, and the windows were covered with grime. But what caught my eye wasn't the state of the house, it was the front door. It was slightly ajar, and from where I stood, I could see a faint flicker of light coming from inside, like a candle or a flashlight. Every instinct told me to turn around and go home. I'm not a naturally curious person, and I have no idea what made me decide to keep walking, but I did. I moved cautiously toward the house, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The closer I got, the more clearly I could hear the voices. They were arguing, and it was getting heated. I could hear one man's voice in particular, sharp and angry, but I still couldn't make out what he was saying. When I reached the front yard, I crouched down behind a bush, feeling ridiculous but not wanting to be seen. My heart was racing, and I was seriously debating whether to call the police. I didn't want to be that person who overreacts, but something was clearly wrong. Before I could decide, the door flew open, and 2 men stormed out, dragging a third man between them. The man they were dragging looked like he had been beaten pretty badly, his face was swollen, and his clothes were torn. They weren't being gentle with him, either. They tossed him into the back of an old van parked on the side of the house like he was nothing. I could feel my stomach drop. This wasn't some petty argument between friends. These guys were dangerous, and I was right in the middle of it. As soon as they threw the man into the van, they slammed the doors shut, got into the front, and sped off down the street. I stayed frozen behind the bush, afraid they'd see me if I moved. Once they were gone, I bolted. I didn't care where I was going, I just ran. My legs were shaking, and my mind was racing. What had I just witnessed? Was I supposed to call the police now? What if they came back and saw me? My heart was pounding, but I kept running until I was back on a street I recognized. When I finally made it home, I collapsed on my couch, trying to process everything. After a few minutes of pacing and trying to calm myself down, I decided I couldn't just ignore what I had seen. I called the police and told them what had happened. They took my statement, but honestly, I didn't expect much to come of it. For all I knew, those guys were long gone by the time the police got to that house. A few days later, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. He told me they had found the man I had seen being dragged into the van. He was alive, but in bad shape. They had found him dumped in a nearby park, and he was refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Apparently, he was involved in something shady, and whatever had happened that night was part of some larger conflict. The detective wouldn't tell me much more than that, but he thanked me for calling it in. They had no leads until I came forward. I stopped running that route after that night. Honestly, I stopped running at night altogether. It's funny how quickly something as simple as an evening jog can turn into a nightmare. Second story. Alright, Reddit, I never thought I'd share this story, but after years of laughing about it, I figured it's time to confess. This is the tale of how a tiny misunderstanding almost derailed my best friend's wedding day. Buckle up. So, it was my buddy, John's wedding, my best friend since high school. We had been through thick and thin together, so naturally, I was his best man. Everything had been going smoothly in the months leading up to the big day. Bachelor party went off without a hitch, all the groomsmen were accounted for, and I had my speech locked down. But as we all know, the real chaos doesn't usually happen until the day of. The morning of the wedding, we were all staying at this old, rustic lodge by a lake where the ceremony and reception were being held. Beautiful place, but with it being out in the middle of nowhere, things were a bit, well, isolated. No cell service unless you walked up a hill about 10 minutes away. That becomes important later. Anyway, the night before the wedding, John had a moment of panic and gave me his phone to hold on to. He was worried he'd lose it or get a bunch of last-minute calls that would stress him out. So, being the responsible best man, I took it and threw it in my suit pocket, thinking nothing of it. Morning rolls around, and everything's going according to plan. The groom and groomsmen are getting ready, having a few laughs, nothing major. The wedding planner comes in to give us a 5-minute warning before the ceremony. I take one last glance at myself in the mirror, adjust my tie, and mentally prepare to stand by John's side. Then John's dad bursts into the room looking like he's seen a ghost. "Where's John?" he barks. My heart drops. John is nowhere to be seen. He had been getting ready right there with us, but apparently, he'd stepped out to take a walk by the lake to clear his head. Normally, that wouldn't be a big deal, but we were running on a tight schedule. And we were minutes away from the ceremony starting. Frantic, I try calling him, only to remember that I still had his phone. No way to contact him. No service to text or call from anyone else's phone. The wedding planner is now pacing back and forth, muttering something about the bride's side starting to notice that something's off. Panic mode activated. I sprint outside and yell for the groomsmen to scatter and search the grounds. John couldn't have gone far, right? But after 10 minutes of running around, there's still no sign of him. At this point, I'm freaking out. The guests are seated, the bride's ready to walk down the aisle, and my best friend is missing. Suddenly, I hear someone shouting from the hill near the lodge. I look up, and there's John, waving his arms and shouting something, but I can't hear him from that distance. I bolt up the hill, out of breath, adrenaline pumping. As I get closer, I finally hear him. I got lost. Turns out, in his pre-wedding nerves, John had wandered too far down one of the wooded trails and, in a complete John move, got lost. He'd been trying to find his way back but somehow ended up even farther from the lodge. With no phone, no map, and nothing but trees around him, he was basically stranded. Classic John. I grab him by the arm and we both sprint back to the lodge, me holding his suit jacket and him trying to fix his shirt while we run. By the time we get back, the wedding planner is nearly in tears, the bride's father is pacing angrily, and all the groomsmen are standing there helpless. We burst through the doors like two marathon runners crossing the finish line. John is sweaty, disheveled, but alive and present. We rush him into his jacket, fix his tie, and I grab his face. "Dude, you got this," I tell him, trying to sound reassuring even though I'm just as shaken as he is. He takes a deep breath, nods, and walks out toward the ceremony. I'm not going to lie, there was a moment there where I genuinely thought the wedding might be over before it even started. But John, to his credit, pulled it together. The ceremony was beautiful, the bride had no idea about the drama that had unfolded, and somehow, I managed to deliver my best man speech without revealing how close we came to disaster. In the end, everything worked out, and it's a story we still laugh about to this day. But seriously, if you ever find yourself the best man at a wedding, take my advice, don't hold onto the groom's phone. You never know when you'll need it. Third story. Alright, Reddit, gather round because I've got a story for you. I never thought a simple road trip would change my perspective on people, but here we are. This is how taking a wrong turn on a solo trip led to one of the most unexpected friendships of my life. So, this all started a couple of summers ago when I decided to take a solo road trip through the Midwest. I was in between jobs and needed a break from everything. No particular destination, just me, my trusty old Honda, and a vague idea of visiting some small towns along the way. It was supposed to be a quiet, reflective trip where I could think about my next steps in life. Spoiler, that's not how it went. On the third day of my trip, I was driving through Nebraska, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The roads were long, straight, and empty, just fields and the occasional barn. I'd gotten into this rhythm where I wasn't even paying attention to my GPS anymore, just following the highway signs and enjoying the view. And that's when it happened, I missed a turn. I didn't realize it at first. The road I was on started to narrow, and after a while, the pavement gave way to gravel. It was getting late, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like an hour. When I finally checked my phone, I saw that I had no service. I pulled over, hoping to retrace my steps on Google Maps, but with no signal, I was out of luck. I figured I'd keep driving and eventually find my way back to the main road. Bad idea. I must have driven another hour before I admitted I was well and truly lost. And to make matters worse, the sun was starting to set. I was in the middle of farm country with no idea how to get back to civilization. Just as I was about to panic, I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a farmhouse. Desperate, I decided to take my chances and head toward it. I pulled into the dirt driveway, half expecting some grizzled old farmer to come out with a shotgun, but instead, I was greeted by a friendly-looking dog and a woman who looked like she was in her mid-50s. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. I explained my situation, and instead of the skepticism I'd expected, she just smiled and said, "Well, you're in luck. We don't get many visitors out here, but I'll make sure you're taken care of." She introduced herself as Linda, and before I knew it, I was sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and a slice of homemade pie. Linda lived alone, except for her dog, Sam, and a few chickens outside. Her husband had passed a few years back, and her kids had moved away, leaving her with the farm. I kept waiting for things to get awkward, but they never did. We started talking, and somehow, hours flew by. Linda told me about how she'd lived on that farm her whole life, how the area used to be more populated, but over the years, people had left for the cities. She missed the company but didn't mind the quiet. She was one of those people who just radiated warmth and made you feel like you'd known them forever. At some point, I realized it was well past dark, and there was no way I was going to find my way back that night. Linda must have sensed this because she offered to let me stay in her guest room. I hesitated, but it was late, and I didn't have much of a choice. The next morning, after a huge breakfast, I swear, the woman made enough food for an army. Linda helped me figure out where I'd gone wrong. She gave me directions back to the main highway, but before I left, she insisted on packing me a lunch. I don't know what it was, but something about her kindness just hit me. I'd been expecting the worst, maybe because of all the horror stories you hear, but instead, I found this incredibly generous person who barely knew me but treated me like family. As I got back on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about Linda. Here was this woman living alone in the middle of nowhere, but instead of being bitter or lonely, she was one of the happiest, kindest people I'd ever met. It really made me question some of my own assumptions about life and people. We're all so quick to judge or assume the worst, but sometimes, when you take a wrong turn, you end up finding something, or someone, you didn't even know you needed. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's the end of the story, right? Wrong. A few months after my trip, I sent Linda a postcard, just to say thank you and let her know I hadn't forgotten about her. I didn't expect to hear back, but a few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Linda. She wrote about how things were going on the farm, how the weather had been rough lately but she was getting by, and how Sam the dog was as energetic as ever. She even invited me to come back and visit anytime. Long story short, I did go back. And not just once. Over the past couple of years, I've made a point of visiting Linda whenever I'm passing through that part of the country. We've become unlikely friends, and every time I visit, I leave with more stories, more food than I can handle, and a renewed sense of what really matters in life. So yeah, that's my story. I guess the lesson here is that sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them, and the people you meet by chance can end up being more important than you ever imagined. And honestly, if you ever find yourself lost in the middle of nowhere, maybe don't freak out. You never know who you might meet.